Addressing climate change is about lots of things, but saving the planet is not one of them. It is about the fact that one of the most recently arrived species on the planet, which are human beings, have been phenomenally successful and enjoy an extraordinary degree of prosperity and control over their own destiny. And the condition precedent for that extraordinary success of this one lately arrived species is climate stability, which we've enjoyed for the last 300 or 400 years. 7 billion of us already here, going on 9 billion in the first half of this century. We won't be able to continue enjoying that prosperity if we have a global average temperature rise of 4 degrees or more. I first got interested in climate change when I was a minister responsible 20 years ago. And at that time, unlike now, many industries were a bit hostile to the actions that were needed to address it. I'm happy to say that position is transformed. I think most industries recognize the opportunities of a low-carbon world and also the threats to their business model if they remain highly fossil fuel dependent. Alongside that change, to a much greater extent than I think is evidenced by the glacial progress of the United Nations process to address climate change in the last 16 years, actually what's happening on the ground is that many governments are taking this very seriously. More and more countries have actually passed laws, as the Globe legislation study, which I've got here and copies are available outside, show. That's an increasing trend. Most crucially, perhaps, in China, where the 12th five-year plan, which we're about halfway through, contains an impressive range of carbon initiatives. It shows how the level of engagement in the PRC in the climate change agenda has been absolutely transformed in the last 10 years. In my view, China is now moving from being a laggard to a leader on climate change because it has understood how vulnerable its country is to the effects of climate change, one of the most exposed in the world. But even in America, if you look at what's happening on the ground, the bottom-up process in some states now with quite impressive initiatives in place. And of course, the president in his second term is courageous enough at last, at least to mention it in the inauguration speech, to include it in the State of the Union message, to appoint a Secretary of State who's had a long-term interest in addressing climate change. The first absolutely essential policy tool for investors is a carbon price high enough to drive low-carbon investment. That can be achieved either through carbon trading or through carbon taxes. I prefer trading because a cap-and-trade scheme means exactly that, a limit on the emissions permitted. Carbon taxes, by contrast, don't impose a limit, and you can never predict the elasticity of the market's response. At home, for example, however high you put petrol taxes up, people go on using their cars. Cap and trade should ensure that investment is allocated in the most efficient way. Of course, I appreciate that the European Union emissions trading system has so far failed to deliver a high enough carbon price to incentivize investment. But flawed implementation in one case does not invalidate the concept. The EU ETS failed in phase one because of lobbying by industries and countries for caps that were far too high. And of course, any emissions trading system that's really going to work should auction the permits and not allocate them. It failed in phase two because in 2008, when the limits were set, nobody had foreseen either the severity or the length of the recession that has gripped Western Europe. Attempts to rectify this in phase three were sadly thwarted last month through a vote in the European Parliament, where I deeply regret to say that it was colleagues from my party which voted the wrong way. But the EU has proved you can have a trading system covering 27 countries, 500 million people, in an area which has 30% of the world's GDP. Encouragingly, there's growing interest in emissions trading elsewhere. I've mentioned the PRC, where they're piloting schemes in 5 provinces and 2 cities. I mentioned America, where California started its emissions trading in January, and the governor and his staff are very committed to its success. Australia may be temporarily looking as though it may move the wrong way if we have a change of government as expected in September. But other countries like Korea are now seriously engaged in preparing for emissions trading. For countries which won't have it, carbon taxes are an alternative. But funnily enough, as I go around the world, I don't find lots of people saying, please, let's pay more tax. I wouldn't expect that here in Hong Kong, but even in areas where historically and culturally we're used to high taxes, there's not an appetite for introducing new ones. In Britain, we do have a further refinement on carbon trading, and that's carbon budgeting. The 2008 Climate Change Act established a statutory body called the Climate Change Committee, which sets a 5-year carbon budget and then audits the progress the government's making towards achieving that. And those budgets have been set out as far as 2027. It's a really valuable signal, in my view, for investors to demonstrate the commitment of the government to making sure the economy is gradually decarbonised. Obviously, many low carbon technologies are more expensive than the high carbon alternatives. Generating electricity by burning coal, and to some extent gas now the price has fallen, is cheaper than doing so in a more sustainable way. So we do need financial incentives to back up a carbon trading system, and the key is a stable policy framework, which means that people have a degree of predictability about what's going to happen. There's even a role, in my view, for old-fashioned regulation, provided it is introduced on a timescale which respects the investment cycles of the industry concerned. In the EU, there's been success in improving vehicle emission standards through regulation, and that has not destroyed the market for new cars and trucks. If anything, it's actually promoted it. For some technologies, commercialisation is so far out, it needs an actual subsidy, and therefore direct funding is justified. But in conclusion, I can see Andrew looking at his watch. We need a carbon price. Cap and trade is the best way to do it. Taxes could work. A stable policy framework of incentives can back it up. Regulation can play a part. Direct funding does have a role. But the scale of the problem is huge. The time is not on our side. The world's response needs to be bigger and faster than it has been so far. I think with businesses and governments working together, there are some encouraging signs.